Before I start story, I want you to imagine yourself as it's happening with you and comment down below where you're watching from. So let's get started. There's something about a new place, isn't there? New surroundings, fresh start. That's exactly how I felt when I moved into the apartment. It seemed perfect at first, but soon I realized it was anything but. I remember the day I moved in, like it was yesterday. It was a small apartment complex, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. I wasn't expecting much, just a place to call my own, away from the hustle of life. The kind of building where you'd hardly see your neighbors. I was okay with that. Privacy was something I craved after years of shared spaces and overcrowded streets. I made a quick tour of the place as soon as I walked in. The hallway smelled of old wood and dust. The walls were thin, and I could hear faint murmurs from behind the doors as I passed. It wasn't anything unusual, just the sounds of everyday life, or so I thought. My apartment was on the second floor, tucked between two others. I barely noticed the door across the hall when I first arrived, but something about it stuck with me as soon as I stepped inside. It was an old building, but it wasn't falling apart. A bit of character, as some would say. I unpacked my things, got settled, and went about my business. The first few days were uneventful. I greeted a few neighbors here and there. Nothing strange, nothing that raised an eyebrow. But it was that first night when I began to notice something odd. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps outside my door. At first, I thought it was just someone coming home late, but the pattern was strange. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I held my breath, wondering if someone was lingering. Maybe a neighbor was just getting a bit too close to my space, but when I peeked through the peephole, there was nothing, just silence. I shrugged it off and went to bed. But the next night, it happened again. Footsteps in the hall, pacing. They paused outside my door. Only this time, I heard a faint tapping, as if someone was lightly knocking, but holding back. I didn't open the door, but I couldn't ignore it either. The tapping continued for a while, and then it stopped. Not the kind of thing you forget. The strange occurrences didn't end there. A few days later, I noticed something else. The apartment directly across the hall from mine was dark. No lights ever came on. No sounds came from inside. At first, I thought maybe it was just empty. But as the days went by, I realized I had never seen anyone come or go from that apartment. It was strange, even for an older building like this one. I started asking around. At the grocery store, I bumped into a couple of the other tenants. The usual small talk. Nothing major, just casual introductions. But when I mentioned the neighbor across the hall, they gave me the strangest looks. "Oh, that apartment," one of them said with a nervous laugh. "I think it's been vacant for a while now. Nobody stays there." "Really?" I asked. I could have sworn I heard someone moving around in there. The woman gave a tight-lipped smile and shrugged. "Sometimes things aren't what they seem around here." I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe they were just being overly cautious. But then, it happened again. The footsteps, the tapping. This time, it was right outside my door at 3 a.m. I felt my pulse quicken as I stared at the door, my hand frozen on the doorknob. I wanted to open it, confront whoever or whatever was on the other side, but something stopped me. Maybe it was the silence, or maybe it was that nagging feeling in the back of my mind telling me that I wasn't alone. I waited breathless for what felt like an eternity, and then nothing. The sounds stopped again. I slowly backed away from the door and sat on the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what was going on, But I knew one thing for sure. There was something wrong with that apartment across the hall. Something that didn't fit. Something that was trying to stay hidden. And I was going to find out what. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was like the whole building had a strange aura about it, and no one was talking about it. I passed by the apartment across the hall countless times, but it never felt right. The silence in that space was almost suffocating, as if it was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. One evening, curiosity finally got the better of me. I had to know if there was really someone or something living in that apartment. Maybe I was just imagining things, but my gut told me otherwise. I waited until late that night, around 2 a.m., when the building was quiet. The lights were dim. The hum of the refrigerator in the hall was the only sound. I stood by my door, pretending to be lost in thought, when I heard the familiar tapping once more. It was coming from across the hall, faint but unmistakable. I crept closer to the door, trying not to make a sound. I was frozen in place, my ear pressed to the cold wood of my door as I strained to hear. The tapping had stopped, replaced by a faint shuffling, like someone was dragging something heavy across the floor. I couldn't tell where the sound was coming from. It was muffled, almost as if it was traveling through the walls. I glanced at the peephole again, heart racing. There was no one in the hallway. I quickly pulled away and stood in the middle of my apartment, trying to steady my breathing. Was I losing my mind, or was something, really in that apartment? The silence lingered for a moment before I made up my mind. I wasn't going to let this mystery go unsolved. I grabbed my keys and moved toward the door, trying to shake off the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. I stepped out into the hallway, cautiously glancing both ways. The building felt eerily empty, the kind of quiet that seemed unnatural. I approached the door to the vacant apartment across the hall. It was slightly ajar, just enough to make me hesitate. My heart thudded in my chest, but I forced myself to move closer. The door creaked open when I pushed it gently. I stepped into the apartment, the air thick with the smell of dust and something else I couldn't quite place, like old, decaying wood. It was cold, colder than the rest of the building. The furniture, what little there was, looked outdated and covered in dust. But what stood out the most was the complete lack of any personal belongings. No photos, no decorations. It felt as though someone had intentionally stripped the space of anything that could give it a sense of life. I crept further inside, my steps muffled on the old carpet. I could still hear the faint dragging sound, though now it seemed closer. I turned the corner, and my breath caught in my throat. There, in the center of the living room, was a figure, a man, sitting perfectly still. His back was hunched, his hands folded in his lap. His head was bowed, as if he was waiting for something. He was completely still, his clothes tattered and worn. His face was obscured by shadows, but there was something wrong about him. Something unnatural. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body refused to obey. I stood frozen in place, staring at the figure as it remained motionless, its presence heavy in the air. The shuffling noise continued behind me, though now it seemed to be coming from within the walls. Then, without warning, the man slowly lifted his head. His eyes were wide open, but there was nothing behind them. No emotion, no life. Just empty hollow sockets that seemed to pierce through me. "Why are you here?" his voice rasped, a hoarse whisper that sent chills down my spine. I couldn't answer. My throat was dry, my body paralyzed with fear. The air grew colder still, and I realized that I had made a terrible mistake. The apartment wasn't empty. It had never been empty. Suddenly, the silence was broken by the sound of the door slamming shut behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The figure in the chair was gone. The room felt even more oppressive, as if something invisible was closing in on me. The walls seemed to be breathing, in and out, the space shifting around me. I stumbled back, trying to make my way toward the door, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. The more I struggled, the more the apartment seemed to shift, twisting in ways I couldn't understand. The walls stretched, the shadows deepened, and I realized I wasn't alone in this place, not anymore. I finally managed to yank the door open and stumbled into the hallway, gasping for air. But when I looked down the corridor, everything had changed. The building that once seemed so familiar now felt like a maze, its walls shifting and narrowing as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The apartment doors were gone. The hallway stretched endlessly into darkness. I ran, blindly, hoping to find an exit, but the building had swallowed me whole. I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The neighbor across the hall, the strange sounds, the figure in that room. They were all a part of something much darker than I had ever imagined. And then just when I thought I was finally free, I heard it. Footsteps echoing behind me, slowly, deliberately, closer and closer. I turned around, heart in my throat. But there was nothing there, just the same empty hallway. I didn't stay to find out. I didn't stop running. I couldn't. My mind was racing, my body moving on instinct as I tried to find a way out of the building. The hallways seemed to stretch on forever, twisting in ways they hadn't before. My apartment, the one I had just moved into, was nowhere to be found. It felt like the entire building had swallowed me up, disorienting me, pulling me deeper into its labyrinth. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and the temperature seemed to drop with each passing second. I could feel the presence behind me, like a shadow watching. The footsteps had started again, slow and steady, tapping lightly against the floorboards, almost as if they were mocking me. I didn't dare look back. I kept moving, blindly searching for an exit, any exit. My breath came in sharp, frantic gasps as I passed door after door, all identical, all closed. It felt like they were closing in on me, each one growing tighter, the space between them shrinking, the walls pressing in from all sides. The building was shifting, changing, and I couldn't make sense of it. Finally, I reached a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, just like the one across from my apartment. It beckoned me, offering the promise of escape. I didn't think. I just pushed through, hoping it would lead me outside. But when I stepped into the room, my stomach twisted in horror. The space was familiar, too familiar. It was my apartment, the same layout, the same furniture. Everything was exactly as I had left it when I first moved in. No, this wasn't possible. How could it be? I had just been outside, hadn't I? The hallway, the maze, the doors. None of it made sense. I stumbled back, my mind spinning. Was I losing my mind? Was this some kind of sick joke? I touched the walls, expecting them to be cold, but they were warm, almost too warm, as if they had been waiting for me. The room felt alive. The shadows seemed to twitch, moving ever so slightly, as if something was lurking just out of sight. I heard a sound, faint at first, but it grew louder, a low hum, a whisper, calling my name. I turned toward the sound, my body frozen in fear. And there, standing in the doorway, was the neighbor, the man I had seen, sitting in the chair earlier. His face was even more lifeless than before, those hollow eyes staring straight through me. But this time, there was something different. His lips parted, but instead of words, a low, guttural growl emerged. "You shouldn't have come," he rasped. His voice, not his own. It sounded distant, as if it was coming from all directions at once. The air around me seemed to ripple. The walls of my apartment began to warp, shifting like liquid. The figure took a step forward, and with each movement, the room twisted in unnatural ways. The space around me started to stretch and bend, becoming something unrecognizable. I backed away slowly, but the door behind me slammed shut with a deafening crack. I was trapped. The room was alive, pulsating, and the figure was closing in. It was as if the entire building was trying to consume me, pulling me deeper into its dark, twisted embrace. "Why are you here?" the man asked again, his voice now almost a growl. His features seemed to blur, shifting in and out of focus like he was being pulled between dimensions. I had no answer, no reason for any of this. The strange footsteps, the tapping, the whispers, it was all leading to this moment. I turned and ran toward the window, hoping to break free, but the glass was gone. Instead, there was nothing but darkness outside, stretching infinitely. My reflection stared back at me from the empty space, but it was different. It wasn't me anymore. The face in the window was twisted, distorted, like it was pulling away from me, trying to escape. I slammed my hands against the window frame, but there was no way out, no way to escape the darkness closing in. The shadows around me began to move faster, swirling together, until they formed a figure. It was the neighbor again, but this time he wasn't alone. Behind him, there were more figures, faces, twisted and contorted, all staring at me with the same hollow eyes. There was no escape, no way out of this nightmare. "You shouldn't have come," the neighbor repeated. But now, his voice was joined by others. Thousands of voices, all speaking at once. The sound was deafening, like a cacophony of whispers, growing louder and louder until it drowned out everything else. I tried to scream, but the words wouldn't come. I was frozen, trapped in this distorted reality, unable to move. The figures advanced toward me, their hollow eyes locked on mine. And then I realized something. This wasn't an apartment building. It wasn't even a place. It was a trap, a prison for those who dared to uncover its secrets. I turned to run again, but the walls closed in around me, the space shrinking until there was nothing left. Just darkness, just silence. The footsteps started once more, echoing in the distance, and I knew, deep down, that I would never escape. The silence felt suffocating, like the very air was thickening around me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was listen to the endless footsteps, the relentless echo that seemed to come from every direction. The darkness pressed in, closing around me like a vice, and I felt myself being pulled deeper, further into this endless void. I couldn't remember how long I had been here, or if I had ever truly left. Time had stopped making sense, like it was being twisted and bent to the will of this place. I tried to scream again, but no sound came out. It was as if the very act of trying to make noise was forbidden here, as if the place itself would devour anything I threw at it. But then, in the middle of the suffocating silence, I heard something different, a low, faint hum, like the sound of a distant song. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't beautiful. It was wrong. The melody seemed to vibrate within the walls, bending the air around me, and in the midst of that distorted tune, I heard a voice that didn't belong to any of the figures or the neighbors, a voice that seemed to come from the very building itself. "Leave," It whispered, its tone both pleading and commanding, as if the building had grown tired of my presence, tired of the intrusion. I wanted to leave. More than anything, I wanted to escape. But the building had me now, and it wasn't going to let go. The walls around me began to ripple again, warping and shifting, like they were breathing. I stumbled back, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't. The ground beneath me felt unstable, and as I took another step, I suddenly found myself back in that apartment, my apartment, or what was left of it. But it wasn't the same. It was darker. The shadows were thicker, more oppressive, and the air felt heavier. The space stretched before me, an endless corridor leading to nowhere. I wasn't sure if I was still in the building, or if I had crossed into something else entirely, something far worse. I turned around, but the door was gone. The window was gone. There was no way out. There was no way to escape the endless loop this place had trapped me in. It had become my prison, and I had no choice but to endure it. The footsteps returned again, growing louder, more urgent. But this time, I wasn't alone. I could hear other sounds, faint whispers, low and guttural, crawling across the walls. They sounded like they were coming from everywhere, from all directions at once. The figures appeared once again. The same hollow-eyed, twisted faces. The same empty gazes that pierced straight through me. But now, there were more of them. So many more. All standing silently in the corners of the room, just out of reach, watching me, waiting for something. I backed away, desperate, but there was nowhere to go. The room seemed to contract, pulling in tighter and tighter with every passing second. I felt the weight of the building pressing down on me, suffocating me. I was losing myself, my sense of who I was, swallowed whole by the very place that had once seemed so simple, so ordinary. "Why did you come here?" a voice whispered from the corner. I couldn't tell which figure it came from. It was like the words were coming from within the walls themselves. I didn't answer. What could I say? There was no answer to give, no way to explain why I had come. The only thing left now was the silence, the darkness, and the footsteps. The footsteps that were growing closer. I didn't know how much time had passed, or if time even existed here anymore. Everything was a blur, a twisted distortion of what had once been real. The footsteps were the only thing that remained constant, the only thing that seemed to have any power in this place. But I knew deep down that they weren't just footsteps, they were mine. I was the one walking. I was the one trapped in this endless nightmare, and no matter how much I struggled, no matter how much I tried to escape, I could never outrun the sound of my own steps. The footsteps stopped, and I realized with a sickening certainty that I would never leave. I was the last one left, the last to hear the endless tapping of the footsteps, the last to face the hollow-eyed figures, and I was the one who would never be free. So, here's the end. Hope you enjoyed it. Just tell me how the story was in the comment box. I will see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.